appreciate you engaging in a discussion about our children. First order of business, a couple of brief administrative things. I would really suggest that you move into these two forward sections because some of the printing on these screens is relatively small. And Bridget says that you'll have a little bit better luck reading it if you do move forward. There are two tables back there. The table on this side has got resources that you're free to take. There is no charge, so go ahead and help yourself. We just ask that whatever you take gets used. And over on this side, there are some, or have I got that backwards?
They're all on the same table.
Okay, I'm sorry. They're all on the same table. The stuff that's on towards the aisle is yours to take. There are some resources there that there's only one copy. The Comprehensive Sex Ed Standard is there. We only have one copy, so it's there for you to look at, but not take with you. And there's also a couple of other things that it's pretty evident what is there to take and what you need to leave. So, this is actually the second session of this presentation in this general area. So I'm really grateful to see a good turnout tonight. I thank you for coming and making the time in your schedule to be a part of this. Obviously, what we are concerned about is not what party you belong to or what church you belong to. We're concerned about what is happening in the lives of our children and our grandchildren. There are two resources back there. One is entitled The Sexual Holocaust. This has been written jointly by Bridget and John Sanford. An excellent read, not an easy one. It has got a whole host of footnotes and citations, over 200. It is fact-based, and that was one of the things I really appreciated about it. It's not opinion, but it's the basis of a lot of research that has gone into it and that they have called out in order to put some organization to it. They've done an excellent job in my estimation. The second item that's back there is, I'm going to tell you, is every bit as good. And thanks, Jason, for making this available. I've read through this as well. This is a great resource. The only thing I can find fault with it about is they entitled it Parent Resource Guide. In my estimation, they should have entitled it Parent and Grandparent Resource Guide. Because if you're a grandparent even, you need to know what's in here. There's a glossary of terms, there's frequently asked questions, and I'll tell you what, the frequently asked questions are very, very illuminating. And again, fact-driven. On that second chapter of frequently asked questions, there's over 40 footnotes and citations. So once again, this is not based on somebody's opinion. This is based on research and fact and data. And so I think these two resources that are free for you to take are going to be extremely valuable. Bridget Heap has, and I should have gotten the bio on you, Bridget. She has got a bachelor's in math with a master's in philosophical apologetics. She's a smart lady, okay? And John Sanford, who is here in the front row here, is a PhD geneticist. So if you have any questions about evolution, talk to him. He's a great resource. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite Bridget up, and she can begin her presentation to us. Oh, you don't need this.
All right, can everybody, no? I'm good. Can everybody hear me? We good? Okay. All right, well, thank you, Steve, for having me out this evening, and thank you all so much for joining us. Tonight, I would like to start by reading a short excerpt from Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. She writes in that book, "Seated next to my father in the train compartment, I suddenly asked, 'Father, what is sexual sin?' He turned to look at me, as he always did when answering a question, but to my surprise, he said nothing. At last, he stood up, lifted his traveling case, and set it on the floor. 'Will you carry it off the train, Corrie?' he said. I stood up and tugged at it. It was crammed with the watches and spare parts he had purchased that morning. "It's too heavy," I said. "Yes," he said, "and it would be a pretty poor father who would ask his little girl to carry such a load." It's the same way, Corey, with knowledge. Some knowledge is too heavy for children. When you are older and stronger, you can bear it. For now, you must trust me to carry it for you. Now, I read this to you tonight because our society has forgotten how to protect childhood innocence from dangerous and destructive knowledge. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about tonight. Dangerous and destructive ideologies that are systematically being taught to our children. Ideologies that are sexualizing our children, normalizing all forms of sexual behaviors, creating gender confusion, encouraging irreversible harmful medical practices, excluding parents from their primary roles as educators and protectors of their children, and using schools as the method of indoctrinating our children to buy into these ideas. Now, those claims might sound extreme, but they are no exaggeration. Comprehensive sex education and gender ideology have crept into almost every public school in one form or another. So my goal tonight is to help inform you about the harmful messages your children are learning and to encourage you to protect your children. Just so you understand where we're coming from as an organization, we believe that children need to be protected, that stable parents and families are the primary protectors of their children, that we are all created either male or female. We need to treat everyone with compassion, and educational institutions should respect and support parents, being sensitive to the parents' cultural and religious beliefs. Now, we are not here tonight to disparage public schools. We are so thankful for all of the teachers, the faculty, and the staff that have devoted their lives to educating our children in these communities. And we really do pray and hope that our public schools will be a safe place for children to be educated. So this evening, we're first going to talk about what's happening. I'm going to share some examples all across New York State. We'll look at the New York State legislation. We'll talk about the national sex ed standards. I'll give you a few examples of those standards as well as curriculums that conform to those standards. We'll talk about why these issues matter. We'll look at the harmfulness of the comprehensive sex education programs, and then we'll look at the harms of both comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about these issues. So as I mentioned, tonight we are talking about two separate issues, gender ideology and comprehensive sex education. Gender ideology is the teaching that gender is fluid, subjective, a spectrum, and it's different from your biological sex. The comprehensive sex ed is a sex ed program for kindergarten through 12th grade that focuses on the sexual pleasure and the sexual rights of children. Now, we're not opposed to sex education. However, we are greatly concerned about what our children are learning from the comprehensive sex ed programs. Now, gender ideology and comprehensive sex education, they overlap quite a bit. And that's because comprehensive sex education programs teach gender ideology. However, schools can promote gender ideology even though they don't necessarily have a comprehensive sex education program. And I'm going to give you some examples of this in a minute. So let's start off by talking about what is actually happening in New York. We'll look at examples from elementary schools up to college, as well as from rural schools to city schools. And I just want to remind you that these are just a handful of examples, just a few of them. We are only scratching the surface of this issue tonight. Our first example is from a rural school. So at Livonia Middle School, recently this year, a sixth grade math teacher had showed transgender videos during class. And an 8th grade English teacher had made students sit down in a circle and talk about transgenderism, even though the students had said they don't feel comfortable doing so. So from this example, we can see that children are currently learning about gender ideology through activist teachers. Now, our next example is of a New York State charity whose mission is to help rural public schools. So Hope in a Box equips educators with LGBTQ inclusive books, curriculum, training, and mentorship. And again, their focus is to help the rural public schools. Now, I contacted this organization to learn more about their influence in New York, and they told me that they've already donated to 40 schools in New York, most of which were in upstate Western New York. Now, as you can see, It Feels Good to Be Yourself. This is a cover of one of the books that this organization is donating, and I will actually read a few pages from this book in a little bit. So as we can see from this example, children are currently learning about comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology through the books in their libraries and classrooms. Our next example is of a suburban school. So in Pittsford, 2 elementary schools recently hosted Rainbow Clubs. Rainbow Clubs are the elementary version of Gender and Sexuality Alliance programs. So at this particular after-school club, children were read the book, The Gay BCs. Now another similar example was at Livonia, where the GSA leader had spearheaded making transgender celebration posters, and the parents were not notified that these would be going up in the school. So from these 2 examples, we can see that children are being exposed to gender ideology through after-school clubs without parental consent. Our next example is from another suburban school. So my colleague Carrie, who couldn't be here with us this evening, she used to be a counselor at a suburban school in Rochester. And through the Dignity for All Students Act, she was expected to affirm the new gender identity of all of the students who she counseled. So from this example, we know that children are being exposed to gender ideology through even the counseling offices. Our next example is from another rural school. So the Geneseo superintendent spoke to a friend of ours at FMS and said that their district's policy is to not inform the parents if a child identifies as transgender at school. So what we're actually seeing is that many schools are being led to believe that their job is to support and affirm a child's new gender ideology and to protect those students from any parents, including their own, who might disagree with affirming gender confusion. So as we can see from this example, parents are being excluded from protecting and educating their own children. Our next example is again from Pittsford. So just this past month, the Parent Teacher Student Association recently advertised a family drag show that was put on by the Pittsford community. There was a video that parents had posted to the Pittsford Parent Facebook group of this family drag show where children are actually going up to the drag performer named Max Pleasure and giving him money. I cannot tell you how heart-wrenching it is to watch these videos, and they are ubiquitous. Family drag shows are incredibly popular right now across the nation. So from this example, we can see that children are being groomed to advocate for gender confusion. Our next example is from a city school. So the Post-Standard reported earlier this year that at the Syracuse City School District, some of the teachers there rely on outside organizations like Reach CNY to come in and teach sex education. So Reach CNY uses this curriculum, Be Proud, Be Responsible. Planned Parenthood also uses this curriculum, Be Proud, Be Responsible. Now, Planned Parenthood is the largest sex educator in America. They reach 1.2 million people a year, and most of those individuals are middle and high schoolers. Tonight, I'm actually going to read a few of these lessons to you from this curriculum. So from this example, we can see that comprehensive sex ed is already being taught in our New York schools through visiting organizations. Now, our final example is from another rural school. One math teacher in Caledonia had warned parents about the curriculum prodigy. So here is one example of a question that had been found in Prodigy. It says, a class has 30 students. There are 15 students that identify as non-binary. What is the ratio of non-binary students to other genders? So from this example, it's evident that these issues aren't just isolated to sex education and health classes. It's actually permeating the entire curriculum, including mathematics. Okay, so that is just very briefly a few examples of what we're seeing happening throughout New York. And now I want to talk about the legislation that's concerning us. And I want you to just note that since the legislative session is over for this year, the names of these bills may change come January. But just because the legislative session is over and these bills aren't going to be addressed for a few months, that doesn't mean that these issues are done with, okay? So these bills can still be addressed come January. Now, this legislation, if passed, is going to expand everything we've already seen. So even if these things aren't all already happening at your child's school, they will be if these bills get passed. So the first bill that we're going to talk about briefly is the Senate Bill S2584A and the Assembly Bill A6616. So if this bill passes, it will require comprehensive sexuality instruction for students in grades kindergarten through 12th grade that includes a model curricula for comprehensive sexuality education and at a minimum conforms to the content and scope of the National Sexuality Education Standards. And that's why we're going to talk about those standards tonight, because if this bill passes, kids K through 12 are going to be learning at a minimum for these standards. Now, there is an opt-out portion with this bill. However, it applies to the HIV and AIDS prevention lessons, and it's not necessarily applicable for the rest of the comprehensive sex ed lessons. This means that parents aren't necessarily going to have an opt-out option for their kids for these lessons. This second bill that we just need to be aware of is the Senate Bill S369 and the Assembly Bill 840. If this bill passes, it's going to ensure that schools and school employees treat students consistently with their gender identity or expression, including using pronouns and names consistent with the student's gender identity or expression. It's also going to allow students to participate in sex-segregated activities and access sex-segregated facilities in a manner consistent with the student's gender identity or expression. That's why we're seeing so many sports teams. Now we have transgendered students on sports teams. So it's also going to protect students' privacy related to their transgender or gender non-conforming status. So in other words, a child doesn't need parental consent to change their school records. So in short, if this bill passes, it's going to mandate that all school districts have to have gender-affirming policies. Okay, so obviously this legislation is going to change a lot about life. I just want to highlight three things. So first of all, it's going to decrease control at the local level and decrease parental input. So right now, comprehensive sex education is not mandated. So schools can actually choose their curriculums. However, if this bill passes, then their choices are going to be much more limited and parents are not going to have as much say. Also, this is going to decrease job security. So my colleague Carrie, she had a friend in Indiana who used to be a teacher, and the way he thought he would handle the gender issue was to call all of his students by their last name. However, some of the students felt that because he was not affirming their new gender identity by using their chosen pronouns, that his classroom was not a safe environment for them. He was forced to resign and he lost his lawsuit. Now, finally, in this section here, these bills can also increase pressure on students, not only to participate in these comprehensive sex education lessons, but also because of that opt-out, but also that they too need to affirm their peers in their peers' new gender identity as well. So some of you may know about the SUNY Geneseo student who a few years ago had been suspended because on his social media, he wrote that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. Now, he did win his lawsuit and was reinstated back to SUNY Geneseo. So we are seeing that there are some wins and losses right now. Okay, so again, that's just very briefly about the legislation. And Jason McGuire is here this evening, so if you do have any questions about any of the legislation and that type of stuff, we can go ahead and ask him. But right now, I want to transition into the national sex ed standards. And again, we're just going to take a very brief look at these tonight. There are actually 165 standards, and again, I'm only going to show you a handful of them. Now, these standards have been written to reflect the ideology that children are sexual from birth. And because they're sexual from birth, educational systems should teach children about sexual pleasure and their sexual rights, and should help those kids protect their sexual rights. So keep that in mind as we go through these standards. Now, these standards have not been created by the federal government, and they are not some kind of US, national standards of education, so don't be fooled by the title. Educational standards are created at the state level, and that's why those bills that we just talked about are so concerning, because that's New York State saying we'd like to adopt these standards as what we're going to be teaching our kids. So these standards were created by individual activist organizations, some of which you can see on the screen, and they just want their standards to be used nationally. Now, we know that these organizations have an agenda. So, for example, CCUS, their slogan is Sex Ed for Social Change. Advocates for Youth, their slogan is Young, Powerful, Taking Over. And GLSEN's executive director had made a statement to NBC basically stating that young people and student groups, like those GSA groups that I mentioned a little earlier, they have always been a breeding ground for activism, and that young people are the way to affect the future. So these national sex ed standards were created specifically to change our society and our culture through our children. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, schools are being used as the primary way to indoctrinate children. And as we go on, I'm going to point out a little bit more of that agenda. So let's go ahead and start off by looking at the youngest years, kindergarten through second grade. This is when children are 5 to 8 years old. The children are expected to define gender, gender identity, and gender role stereotypes. So gender identity, as defined by the National Sex Ed Standards, is how an individual identifies based on their internal understanding of their gender. So it's very subjective. Gender identities may include male, female, agender, androgynous, genderqueer, non-binary, transgender, and so forth. This book, Who Are You?, is a book that conforms to these curriculum standards, and I'm going to read a couple pages to you. Babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. This is the sex assigned to you at birth, male or female. Sometimes people get this confused with gender, but gender is much more than the body you were born with. Some people say there are only 2 genders, but there are really many genders. You are who you say you are because you know you best. Now, with this particular book, there's this fun wheel that the kids get to use, and in the center of that wheel, the center circle says, I have a body that made adults guess that I was a male or guess that I was a female. In the next circle, the children are encouraged to choose their gender identity out of 18 choices, and it includes things like bigender, third gender, and so forth. And in the final outer wheel, children are encouraged to choose how they like to express their gender through things mostly like clothing and activities and so forth. It Feels Good to Be Yourself. This is the book that Hope in a Box is donating to New York schools, and as I promised, I'm going to read a couple pages. When people guess wrong, it's okay to let them know. Ruthie was 5 when she told her parents. I know you think I'm a boy, but really, I feel like a girl. Oops, Ruthie was a girl all along. They just didn't know it at first. You might feel like a boy. You might feel like a girl. You might feel like both boy and girl, or like neither. You might feel like your gender changes from day to day or from year to year. Okay, so those were some examples that conform to those curriculum standards. Now let's look at the next couple grades. So grades 3 through 5. This is when children are 8 to 11 years old. They are expected to describe the role hormones play in the physical, social, cognitive, and emotional changes during adolescence. And if we stopped there, that would be a great standard. Kids who are going through puberty need to understand how and why their bodies are changing. The problem is that while they're being taught about going through puberty, they are also being taught about the potential role of hormone blockers on young people who identify as transgender. So what's happening is that at the younger years, kids are being taught that your gender is fluid, you have to figure it out, and then by the time they're starting to hit puberty, they're being taught that, well, if you haven't figured it out yet, you can take puberty blockers to slow that down to give yourself more time. So in these grades, children are also expected to explain that gender expression and gender identity exist along a spectrum, and to explain the common human sexual development and the role of hormones in things like romantic and sexual feelings and masturbation. So this book, It's Perfectly Normal, conforms to these curriculum standards. This is a very popular book right now. It is in Pittsford Middle School. And I do have a graphic warning on here that the next few images from this book will be graphic in nature. So in a chapter called Perfectly Normal Masturbation, there's a picture of a little boy masturbating and a picture of a little girl masturbating. Now, we have blocked the images. However, they are not covered up in the book. And in this chapter, it explains how to masturbate and makes a point about sexual pleasure. It states, some religions call masturbation a sin, but masturbating cannot hurt you. It also explains orgasm, and it says that some people become sexually excited without masturbating just by looking at sexy pictures. So already we're introducing the concept of pornography to little children. So for the next set of grades, grades 6 through 8, children are around 12 to 14 years old, and they are expected to define vaginal, oral, and anal sex. Now, the definition of vaginal and anal sex given by the National Sex Ed Standards include the use of sex toys. So we can see that there is a clear agenda to focus on sexual pleasure and to normalize all different types of sexual activities with our children. At these grades, children are also expected to explain that there are many methods of short and long-term contraception that are safe and effective, and describe how to access them, and also explain the impact that media, including sexually explicit media, so pornography, what that can have on one's body image and self-esteem. So again, we see this agenda to teach children how to use organizations like Planned Parenthood that have these services, and remember, Planned Parenthood is one of the creators of the National Sex Ed Standards, how to use their services. And this is often without parental knowledge and consent. This is teaching a child sexual autonomy, accessing their own medical care and services on their own, and how to do that whenever they need it. Now, some of the organizations that created the National Sex Ed Standards are pro-pornography and pro-sex work. So by encouraging kids to learn about these concepts and talk about pornography, it is grooming a child to accept pornography and sex work as normal activities. Now, at this stage, children are also taught about agency. Now, we have a video on our website that goes into more detail. But agency is teaching a child that they know when they're ready to engage in sexual activities and what type of activities. So remember I mentioned earlier that these standards assume that children are sexual at birth. So what this is teaching your children is that they have the right to engage in sexual activities as soon as they feel ready. So again, I'm going to go back to this book. It's perfectly normal because this adheres to the curriculum standards. And again, there is a graphic warning. So in a chapter on making love sexual intercourse, there are 3 images of sexual intercourse. Again, we have blocked them out. However, they are not blocked in the book. There's an image of a heterosexual couple engaging in sexual intercourse and 2 homosexual couples engaging in sexual intercourse. And in a section that lists some important things for kids to know and remember, the book states sexual intercourse or having sex can involve the penis and the vagina, or the mouth and the genitals, or the penis and the anus. Now, also in this chapter, the book says this: most often, sexual intercourse happens when 2 people feel very sexy and very attracted to each other, and may also have very loving and romantic feelings about each other. So if you caught what they're teaching your kids, they're telling your kids, if you feel attracted to a person, it's okay to go have sex with them. You don't need to be in a committed relationship. They're teaching kids to separate that concept in their mind. Okay, so this curriculum, the Genderbread Person, teaches children that their gender identity is in their brain, their attraction is in their heart, their biological sex is in their genitals, and their gender expression is in things like their clothing and the activities that they prefer to engage in. This curriculum also teaches students that everything is a spectrum, including their anatomical sex. It encourages children to choose where they fall on each spectrum, and it also has the children choose what sex they were assigned at birth, so either female, intersex, or male. Now, for grades 9 through 10, children are expected to describe effective ways to communicate consent and personal boundaries. Now, again, if we stop there, that is a great standard. We want kids to be able to communicate their personal boundaries and respect other people's personal boundaries. The problem is that they're also being taught how to communicate their desires as they relate to intimacy, pleasure, and sexual behavior. So what we're seeing is that the national sex ed standards are sex positive. This means that it's sex positive at any age as long as you have agency, sex positive with any partner regardless of their age or gender as long as they've given consent, and sex positive for any activity as long as you are reducing your risk of pregnancies and STDs by using things like contraception, abortion, and so forth. So as you can see, the focus here is sex positive, communicating what a child wants, rather than teaching a child how to say no and how to wait. So again, as I promised, I'm going to read to you from Be Proud, Be Responsible. This is a curriculum that conforms to the standards that I just read to you. So the first example from Be Proud, Be Responsible says, people often say that sex doesn't feel as good with a condom, but we're going to talk about ways to make the experience more pleasurable. So again, we see this emphasis on pleasure, but if you notice, there's a subtle lesson to your kids that schools are appropriate places to learn how to have sexual pleasure. The second example here says, touching and stroking each other all over can be very pleasurable. People who are better lovers know about their own bodies and a partner's body. So again, we see this emphasis on pleasure. But again, there's a subtle lesson to your children, that there's a standard, that if they want to be a good lover, they need to know how to pleasure themselves and others. The final example from this curriculum says, the goal of this role play is for Lee to convince Jaden to use a condom, and that condoms can be fun and pleasurable. So again, emphasis on pleasure, but now let's see what's happening. Well, our kids are role-playing these things. They're role-playing having a sexual conversation with somebody that they'd like to engage in a sexual activity with. And so by having your children role-play these things, it is preparing them to have sexual intercourse. Now, for this specific curriculum, there is a note here to teachers, and it instructs teachers to require all students to participate in role plays, even if those students feel uncomfortable doing so. Now, also for grades 9 through 10, children are expected to identify medically accurate sources of information about and local services that provide contraceptive methods, so including emergency contraception and condoms, and also pregnancy options, so including parenting, abortion, adoption, and prenatal care. So again, we can see that the agenda here is to give children sexual autonomy by using agencies like Planned Parenthood for their information and for their direction regarding their choices about contraception, abortion, and adoption, and so forth. So the idea is to teach kids to use these services as a valid healthcare option and to help them make their choices on their own without their parents. So in this curriculum, Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, it's created by Advocates for Youth, one of the creators of the National Sex Ed Standards, we can see how a teacher would teach this standard. So the teacher is expected to give a list of all the services in their area to all of their kids before they teach this lesson. And then the lesson says, before the next class, you need to visit one of these places on the list that the teacher gave them and get a condom. So now we're not just instructing kids how condoms and contraception work in preventing pregnancies and STDs, but we're actually getting it in their hands and teaching them how to access it. The rest of this says, in each situation, you must interact with at least one adult. So now we've gone from, let's get the kids role-playing, having sexual conversations in the classroom, to now go have sexual conversations with adults out in your community. In this curriculum, in a different lesson, it also states that if a clinic receives Title X funding, they must provide contraception without a parent or caregiver's consent. So kids are learning exactly where to go so that they can get what they want, not just contraception, but having abortions, getting puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, even sex reassignment surgeries, how to do all of those things without a parent or caregiver's consent, and oftentimes how to do it and have the state pay for it. So again, this is encouraging sexual autonomy. Now, for the oldest grades, 11 through 12, it's basically everything that we've seen, but more in depth. I just want to go back to this curriculum, Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, because in this curriculum, there's a lesson for 12th graders that teaches that viewing sexually explicit media is not considered a negative by everyone, but people should keep in mind that it is fantasy and not reality. And along with this lesson, there's a PowerPoint for the teachers to show their students, and those PowerPoint slides include the cover of porn magazines. Now, we're not going to be showing any of those images here. We think that's inappropriate for anybody to be looking at, but especially for our children. Now, there are these books on the back table, The Sexual Holocaust. We do talk about the harms of pornography in this book, along with many other harms of what we call anything goes sexuality. So please feel free to take those. We have a couple more boxes underneath, so feel free to grab as many as you need. I'd like to just summarize this section, because there was a ton of information here. So comprehensive sex ed is agenda-driven. It includes sexually explicit materials. It's age inappropriate. It's inappropriate for the school setting. It includes gender ideology, and it's medically inaccurate. Now, oftentimes when people hear us talking about these issues, they think, no, it can't really be that bad. And they go and they read the bills. And the bills claim that the comprehensive sex ed programs are age appropriate and medically accurate. So I just want to talk about those two briefly. Now, as far as age inappropriate goes, I hope that just the handful of examples that I gave you tonight demonstrate that this is inappropriate for children. And I hope that we can stand with Corrie ten Boom's father when we say that there is just some knowledge that is too heavy for children. And our jobs as parents is to protect our kids. And schools should not dictate when our children are ready for sexual activities. Now, as far as this information being medically inaccurate, because these national sex ed standards also teach gender ideology, kids are going to be learning things like you might be a male brain in a female body or vice versa. Or they might be learning that you can become another gender by taking puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and having sex reassignment surgeries. We know that both of those things are not true. We know that male brains develop very differently than female brains. And we also know that things like puberty blockers and hormones and things like that cannot change us, that actually at a cellular level, for each individual, all of their viable cells are either all female or all male. And so those things cannot change your gender. Now, we do know that there are some chromosome deformities out there, but that does not tell us that gender is a spectrum. It tells us that pathologies exist. Now, we also need to be careful because kids aren't getting full medical information about things like contraception and abortion. So that post-standard article that I'd mentioned earlier in the talk, it gave an example of how one of the students in this particular classroom had asked the educator and had said, out of the contraception that you're showing us, what are the side effects? And the educator just said, well, everybody's body's different, so you just have to find what works for you. So we have to be careful that we're not misleading our children and that we're giving them very educated information about medical side effects for these issues. Now, just to summarize gender ideology, it teaches that gender is a choice. Gender can change from day to day. Biological sex is a meaningless guess. Remember, it was assigned to you at birth. Color, clothing, and activity preferences can define your gender. Children can be born in the wrong body. Children understand themselves and how they fit into the world at 5 years old and should correct adults. Children should focus on figuring out their gender identity, and you can be both a girl and a boy, neither or some other choice. Okay, now let's talk about why this matters. So first, we're going to look at the effectiveness of the comprehensive sex ed programs. And as I mentioned, there are 165 standards. So 6 of these standards mention abstinence, but only as a method of birth control. None of these standards actually discuss the proven benefits of saving sexual intercourse for a committed relationship, or even just delaying your initial sexual activity for when you're older. Yet, 40 of these standards focus on the gender identity and sexual orientation. So we can see that there is an agenda to push particular ideologies on children rather than focusing on a child's well-being. Now, we don't have time to get into alternative programs, so I do recommend that you go to weascend.org and take a look at their article on sexual risk avoidance and how that is beneficial. And I do have a link to it on our resource page in case you are interested in that. So let's talk really quick about the actual comprehensive sex ed programs. So the Institute for Research and Evaluation, they did one of the largest studies. They looked at 103 studies of school-based comprehensive sex education worldwide. And what they looked at were key indicators, things like STDs, pregnancies, and so forth. And over a 12-month time period, they were looking to see if those key indicators increased or decreased. So out of all of those studies, 6% of them actually found some benefits. So some of those key indicators did what we want them to do. So pregnancies decreased or STDs decreased, so forth like that. However, 16% of these studies showed that there was actually more harm than good. So those key indicators did the opposite of what we want. Teen pregnancies increased, STDs increased, and so forth. And overall, the effectiveness of the majority of the programs, there was no real effectiveness whatsoever. The key indicators never changed. So the Institute concluded that some of the strongest, most current school-based comprehensive sex ed studies worldwide show very little evidence of real program effectiveness. And I'd go so far as to say we're actually seeing more harm than good. And so that's what I'd like to talk about right now, is what is the harm associated with these issues. This slide is overwhelming, and it's meant to be because there is a lot of harm associated with both comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology. But tonight I'm just going to talk about one point from each of these four topics. So physical, psychological, social, and spiritual harm. So the first thing I want to talk about to you is what happens when a kid comes out and says, I don't identify as my biological sex. Parents and teachers and medical personnel are being encouraged to have that child go through a 4-step transition process. And the reason why they're being encouraged to do this is because that is how they can affirm this child in their new gender identity. So the first step is to have that child socially transition. Have them change their clothes, engage in different activities that the other gender would engage in, and so forth. Schools are making this possible without parents' knowledge. So some schools have closets where a child can leave their house as one gender, go to school and change clothes in a closet with clothes provided by the school, and walk around all day as a different gender, and then change before they go home so their parents don't ever have to know about it. The second step after transitioning socially is to start taking puberty blockers. Now, using puberty blockers as a way to slow down a child's puberty, this is completely experimental right now, and kids as young as 8 years old are starting to get on puberty blockers. The reason why puberty blockers are being encouraged for this use is to give the child more time to discover who they are and to discover their gender. And the idea is that, well, puberty is uncomfortable. It's challenging to go through. So it's devastating for a child to go through puberty as a gender that they don't identify as. But the problem with this is that puberty is necessary for our overall physical development, especially our brain and bone development. So what we're seeing from these kids who are getting on puberty blockers is that they have decreased brain development, a higher likelihood of osteoporosis, decreased self-esteem, because they're watching all of their peers mature and look more like adults, and yet they look very childlike still. And also an increase in depression and suicide. Now, almost all of the children who start on puberty blockers will go on to take cross-sex hormones. Cross-sex hormones in conjunction with puberty blockers will sterilize a child. So we have children as young as 13 who are taking these medications and are becoming sterile for life. At 13, you are too young to buy a lottery ticket, to drive, to purchase alcohol, and yet these kids are being allowed to make this decision that's going to sterilize them for the rest of their life. Now, after a child gets on these cross-sex hormones, they are encouraged to get sex reassignment surgeries. The idea is that the child's sex was assigned to them at birth, and so they can reassign it at any time. So girls as young as 13 are getting double mastectomies. They're having healthy breast tissue removed. Boys as young as 17 are having healthy genitalia removed. These are irreversible procedures. Now, all of this is being pushed because of the idea that if you don't affirm a child in their new gender identity, then they're going to commit suicide. We know that this isn't true. Individuals who have had sex reassignment surgeries are nearly 20 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population, and this is in largely transgender affirming communities that they're still committing suicide. Studies have also showed that if you do not affirm a child in their new gender identity, but rather you affirm them in their biological sex, that 80 to 98% of those kids will actually feel comfortable as their biological sex by the time that they're an adult. So this is entirely irresponsible of adults to allow children to dictate their medical treatment based on personal opinions. Something that they're being taught can change day to day. Why would you have a child go get a sex reassignment surgery when they can wake up the next day and feel like their biological sex? You're just physically destroying them. You're not helping them. The next harm that I want to talk about is the psychological harm. So there's something that we're seeing that is rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, traditionally, males were the ones that most often identified as having gender dysphoria, this confusion between their perceived gender and their biological sex. The onset of it was in early childhood, and it was diagnosed as a mental disorder. Now, however, we are seeing a major shift in this. We are actually seeing that females are the ones that are largely identifying as having a gender dysphoria. The onset of it is in adolescence, and it's being diagnosed just as a discomfort. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders back in 2013 showed that around 1 in 50,000 female children would identify as having gender dysphoria. And 1 in 7,000 male children will identify as having gender dysphoria. This is just to show that it is in a larger number of males than females. However, the American College Association found in 2008 that 1 in 2,000 female college students identified as transgender, whereas last year, 1 in 20 female college students identified as transgender. So what we're seeing here, this is a shift. This is a social contagion. And this ideology is causing gender confusion. So kids that otherwise would not have this psychological disconnect between their perceived gender and their physical bodies are now all of a sudden questioning this. But even more importantly than this, there are children who genuinely have a gender dysphoria. We know that children with ADHD and who are on the autism spectrum are more likely to come out as trans. There is a psychological connection. And yet, by shifting this from a mental disorder to just a discomfort, these kids are not getting the mental health that they need, the mental health support that they need. They need loving and compassionate counselors who are going to share truth with them. They don't need to be pushed or encouraged into that 4-step process that's going to destroy them physically and not ever address that confusion and that hurt that they feel inside. Now, what we're also seeing is that kids are being sexualized. As I mentioned earlier, if these bills pass, there's no opt-out option for children. They have to sit through these lessons. Now, I don't know if you caught this through the talk, but the National Sex Ed Standards taught that kids need to be able to communicate their personal boundaries. And then I shared some examples with you of curriculums that said teachers don't respect those personal boundaries. So what are we seeing here? The idea is to push kids past their personal boundaries. Well, why? Because if you can get kids to role play and have sexual conversations with each other in a classroom, you've had them practice and they'll do it out of classroom. You've prepared them to have and engage in sexual activities. You've normalized these types of behaviors with them. Normalizing pornography, normalizing sex work. So the National Sex Ed Standards are teaching kids that all of this stuff is normal, it's okay. The goal is to sexualize them, and that's clear. Now, as a Christian organization, we do believe that there is a spiritual aspect to this. I want to read to you Psalm 119:13 through 14. And this is from the Bible, and it says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." So this is talking about how God created us, and we're not a mistake. And I hope it's clear that this is a very different message than what children are being taught in schools. That they might have been born in the wrong body, that they have to figure this all out on their own. The Bible teaches you don't need to figure it all out on your own, that God has a plan for you, that he loves you, that he created you either male or female for a purpose. So it should be clear here that comprehensive sex education and gender ideology do not leave room for families with Judeo-Christian values. Okay, so in this last section, I'm going to share some practical ways that we can talk to our kids and talk to others about these issues. So even though I'm going to share some practical ways of engaging with these issues, I cannot stress to you enough how important it is for you as a parent to accept your responsibility to protect your children and to actually do something about it. So first of all, we would encourage you to learn more after this evening. If your kids are currently in a public school, get in there and find out what you can. Review the curriculum, ask to review lesson plans, go volunteer at the school if they take volunteers, meet with the teachers, ask them what their personal opinions are of these issues, how do they deal with it in class, are they teaching these issues? Find out about the after-school clubs. Even if your kids aren't in them, how is it going to impact your child? And you can also search the libraries. So, as I mentioned, we have a resource sheet. There's a copy of it on the back for you to take a look at. If you would like the resource sheet, I forgot to put it out, but I'll put it out when I'm done. We have a sign-up sheet that you can put your email on, and we will just send you all of these resources and links to all of the things I'm about to talk about. So there are ways that you can be informed and learn more specifically about what's impacting your child. Now, on our resource sheet, we also suggest other organizations that you can follow. There are national organizations out there that will keep you updated about legislation and will keep you updated about these issues. So we do recommend that you take a look at those. Now, we also recommend that you learn about education alternatives for your children. And this isn't to disparage public schools, but you as parents are responsible for giving your kids the best education you can. And so if you're not happy with the education that they're getting, please go learn about what other options you have. I personally homeschool my kids. We are literally just feet away from a private school. There's another private school in Geneseo. There are micro schools, charter schools, so please be aware and learn about what other alternatives you have for education. We also encourage you to speak first and foremost to your children about these issues. Ask them, what have they been learning about this stuff? What are their personal views on these issues? Don't be afraid to share your expectations with your children about their sexual health. What standards do you hope they would live by? Talk to them about those issues. Do they understand God's design for them? Have they heard the alternative that God loves them and that they're not a mistake? Now, we also encourage that you speak out to school boards. You can write a short statement, something that takes 2 to 3 minutes to present. We have a few examples. If you're interested in that, but you're not sure what to say, you can contact us or write your email down, and we'll share a few examples with you of things that you can say. But also try to offer an alternative. There are alternative programs, sex ed programs. There are also alternative standards. We don't have to accept the national sex ed standards. The K through 12 standards for optimal sexual development that you can see up here, these standards seem to leave room for folks with Judeo-Christian values. So there are alternatives. Also, we recommend that you speak out to your legislators. New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms makes this super easy. On their website, they've got an email written out for you. You can change what you'd like, and then it goes to your legislators. And then also share information with folks, people in your family, your friend groups, your colleagues. I recommend that you just find something that really impacted you, it hit you, you were surprised about it, and either forward the video to people, post it on social media if you have social media, get a pamphlet or a packet from some of these organizations that I mentioned and share that with folks. Something that you can just say, you know what, I just learned this, you might be interested in this, and pass the information along. Also, there are ways that you can help protect your children right now and to get engaged in the community. If your kids are in public school, comprehensive sex ed isn't mandated right now. So you can write opt-out letters. You can opt your kids out of the lessons that they might be listening to. You can also opt them out of the school policies that might be in place already at your school. So be involved in the school and try to protect your children through that's a way that you can protect your children. You can also become board members. It's too late this year, but if you are interested in that, you can go to the New York State School Board Association to learn more about how you can become a board member. You can also get out there and vote. Vote for things like the budget. Where is the money going to? You can vote for the school board members. So be active and participate in these things. And then finally, you can join local activist organizations. There are several in our area that are actively trying to protect children, to make parents aware of what's going on, and so forth. Now, this issue, obviously, I've only scratched the surface of what's going on tonight. And so these issues are huge. They are bigger than us, but they're not too big for God. And so I would encourage all of you every day to be praying for our children, the parents, the teachers, the faculty, and the staff, our legislators. There is so much that we can be praying for, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of prayer. You are responsible for educating and protecting your children. Please, please do something about this. Now, if you are interested in more information, our website is fmsfound.org. If you do have social media, we just ask that you like our Facebook page. It's Feed My Sheep Foundation. And you can also join our Facebook group that is Alliance to Protect New York's Children. So, at this time, I think I will open it up for questions.
As a learning tool for a naive grandparent, could you be the teacher that said he got fired because he wasn't going to do the curriculum and look at this group of men and women? How should he have addressed us in this new language that you're talking about?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. You're saying if I was that guy who was forced to resign, what would he say?
Yeah. No. What should he be saying? Instead of saying her or him or Sally or Joe, you suggested that
yes. Okay.
there are other pronouns
there
or
are.
something?
Right. So what's going on is basically each individual chooses how they identify. So for example, there are kids walking around that say, I'd like you to identify me as they and them. And so what that means is if you've got a classroom of students, and let's say there's Bob and Sally says, I don't identify as a girl, I'd like to be identified as they and them. If you said something to Bob and said, you need to get Sally's book, if you said you need to get her book, then that would be offensive because you did not use her appropriate pronoun. You would have to say, you need to get them book or they book. I'm not even sure how it works. But you would have to replace that pronoun with something else. And so if you actually look online, like there's hundreds of pronouns. There's like Z and all sorts of stuff. It's basically whatever the child wants to be called, and teachers are expected to know and remember those and call the child that pronoun. And remember, this is something that can change day to day, so the pressure is on the teachers that they conform to this and call their students the appropriate pronouns that they want to be called.
Can they still use their first name like Sally, or is that?
I'm assuming that that's okay, that you can say Sally, but the idea is you have to kind of go with what the kid wants. If they're saying, call me this instead, or whatever, it's the idea that you respect and honor that, and that you're affirming their new gender identity.
Thank you.
Yep.
So the term national sex education standards is a misnomer because it is not by the national government.
It's national in the sense that those organizations are national, but it's not national standards in the sense that our nation has come together and said, yes, these are great standards to have at your state level. Yeah.
So with the comprehensive sex education, how does that impact private schools? Are they allowed to opt out of the curriculum if it comes from New York State?
That's a good question. So what we see is that this type of stuff happens at the state level with public schools first, and then it seeps into the private schools. Now, some private schools are automatically jumping on the bandwagon and going forth with all this stuff anyway, and then some of the other schools, like the Christian schools, are like, whoa, hold the phone, you know, we're not jumping on this bandwagon. But what we see is that eventually the laws do affect the private schools. So, and Jason might be able to speak to this more, but I believe that in the works there is something proposed that the private schools have to conform to the district. And so the district has a voice and a say at looking at the private schools and saying, you know, oh no, you're not quite teaching up to our standards. So I don't think that's in place yet, but it sounds like that is something that's in the process. So I don't know, Jason, you're coming forth in case you want to add anything to that. Okay, it's intimidating me. No, I'm just joking. So the idea is that right now these bills are specifically for public and charter schools, but yes, down the line it will affect the private schools. Yeah.
Can we address that? Or was it?
Yeah, sure. If you add to it, go for it.
All right, is that on? There it is. Sit on. So as far as the private school standards, there have been efforts, for example, we saw the reference to the Dignity for All Students Act. Dignity for All Students Act started out as anti-bullying curriculum, and when it was passing through the legislature, we told the legislators it's going to be used for more than just a kid who's wearing glasses or whatever. It's going to mean lots of other things, and sure enough, that's what they're portraying it as today. Now there's an effort by the same legislators that actually put in the Dignity for All Students Act for public schools a few years ago to make it apply to private schools as well. So the standards then expand to be forced upon private schools. Now, we've kept that at bay at New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms, but the fight is there. And then the standards that Bridget was referencing, the substantial equivalency standards, there is a effort underway to bring greater oversight of private schools by the state. I'm not totally against that. I think there's a certain role that the state does have a responsibility to make sure those kids are educated. It is neglect when kids aren't educated. But at the same time, we ought to have the ability to educate our kids distinctly and according to our faith. So we have some mixed emotions on the standards that are being put out there for substantial equivalency, and we're kind of in a little negotiation phase of the state right now for what those will ultimately look like.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? Oh, okay, John.
I'm just really grateful, Bridget, for that presentation. I actually want us to make a video of it because it gets better every time. It's so great to see so many people here tonight, and you are engaging in this battle that is so incredibly important. And so I just want to, I'm looking for Melanie. There you are. Okay, you moved up. Good for you. So she's starting an organization similar to our own in Canandaigua. So that's really encouraging, right? And so we want to see this go from handfuls of people to armies of people who are, you know, calling out the evil that we see. And so I just really grateful for. I really like to thank Steve Arnold and so much for your helping this ball start going. And Paul Salich, I think you're also key to this. So thanks so much. And so I'll just turn it back over to you, but I just wanted to make those comments.
Thank you, John. I got a question back here, but yeah, we'll
You know, Bridget made first of all, Bridget, great presentation. But Bridget alluded to suicide. And some of you know I'm in the college consulting business. And I have thousands of clients. But just this year, I have a young man who attends Allendale, Columbia, and Bridget and Jason mentioned private schools. And that's a pretty liberal situation. But he was born Lola. And now he's Lee. And so I'm helping him go to college, and his mother's biggest fear is He's a senior in high school. He's already tried to commit suicide 3 times. He's on hormone replacement therapy. Great young man, great person. But I can tell you, Bridget said it, but I think the suicidal issues are bigger than anybody thinks about. Wouldn't you agree, Bridget? I think suicide's huge.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Other questions? I saw a hand back there, yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. My understanding of this is that not only is this issue drastic, right? This is something we don't even want to think about actually passing. But to the point we're at now, do we see this passing at the New York State level if things continue the way they're going?
Yeah, I'll let Jason address that, but before he does, I'll just say, even if it doesn't pass, even if the bills don't pass, you can see from the examples that I started with that this is already happening in New York, and it's just going to grow. And so what the bills are going to do is it's just going to expand what's already happening faster. But I'll let Jason speak to the likelihood of it.
Yeah, so the question, the likelihood of it passing, the bill's been around for about 16 years now that we've been working against blocking it. We've been successful every year. When it was first introduced, it was actually introduced by Senator George Winter, who was a Republican representing not far from this area. Naples is where I was from at the time. He was the sponsor of it. And so we've been successful in blocking it over all those years. Now it's being sponsored locally by Senator Sam Mabrouk, and who represents Naples today, and now is shifting a little more towards Rochester, and an assembly member who's retiring named Kathy Nolan, but it will be picked up by another assembly member in January. So we've been successful with session done for this year. It gets harder every year, though. And depending upon what happens this November may very well depend upon whether or not this passes next January. So today's primary day, for example, right? And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, have you all voted today? Polls are open until 9 p.m. tonight, all right? So we're going to get you out of here in time so you can go vote. But it is important that you do that and you identify candidates that are with you on the issues for that reason, because I can only work with what you send me in Albany. And so if all I have to work with are those that are sponsoring things that are bad ideas, I can't stop that because they're already coming with an ideologically driven agenda. So that's so important. The other thing is, what I think is going to give this issue greater momentum in years to come is the Supreme Court decision that came out last week regarding the overturning of Roe. When that happened, there became new energy in certain states, like New York, to do everything they could to continue to advance education on abortion. I was coming home tonight, and as I was driving the 390 by the airport, I saw the state now has a new billboard up that reminds you can still legally get an abortion. And a big component of these sex ed standards is the abortion education. And when Planned Parenthood comes into a school, I assure you, they're talking to you about those options. That is a funding stream for Planned Parenthood and other organizations to come in and teach those things. It's a funding stream because they're paid to come in and teach that. And it's also a funding stream because when those students then come to the Planned Parenthood clinics or other abortion facilities, they collect the cash from those procedures as well. So there's a financial incentive, and I think you will see more and more momentum come January to make sure that every student is educated in these things. So I think it's going to be a tough fight come January.
To add to that, do we see anywhere, I'm sure if it's been around here from Naples 15 years ago, that it's in other places in the world, do we ever see that the suicide rates or other indicators would cause the legislators to pull back legislation like this automatically?
Yeah, so you would hope, and actually that the one document back there has a few studies in it, and so what we're actually seeing from several other countries right now is they are all pulling back with this, the transgender transitioning process, because they're realizing, whoa, we're creating way more harm than good, and so a lot of other nations or countries are starting to do that. New York and our nation is kind of ignoring all of that research, but yeah, some are seeing that.
The People's Republic of New York, as we like to say, right? You know?
Anybody else have a question?
I have a question. This is a quick question. So, is anyone here, or let me just make this invitation. Is there anybody, thanks, if there's anybody here who's not a Christian, we want to talk with you. We want to share notes together. We just are really eager. You know, this can't be just the church. This is every parent, every grandchild, every grandparent. And so we need to come together, like with the abortion thing, and agree on one thing. And in this case, it is that the schools radically need to be reconstructed.
Yeah, you don't have to come from a faith perspective to actually recognize parental rights, and so John's right. And we're certainly seeing that, and even the work that we're involved in, we are gathering supporters among various faith groups, including Muslims, Jewish community, and others. But there are also people that just believe in parental rights, right? And we have the right to raise our kids that are certainly joining these types of coalitions.
Things have started to take off in the last few years. And I wonder, is that due to a lot of lobbyists or lobbyist organizations? Or?
What do you mean by take off?
Well, you're hearing more about it on TV, even churches sometimes.
So if you mean those that are advocating for these kinds of things, why are you hearing so much about it? Yeah, I think there's a media narrative that's driven towards these types of initiatives, these types of agendas. I mean, you just look at the last few days, the news coverage, seems like it's certainly been very one-sided. It'd be hard to believe there's people that are on the other side of the issue of, for example, the Supreme Court decision, because you only hear from one side. So I think there is a media narrative, and I challenge people that we have to become the media in that sense. We can all write blogs, we can share things on social media, that we can begin to push back a larger media narrative. So I don't think it's just lobbyists that are doing that, but I think there are an awful lot of organizations that are funding these efforts, and there are a lot of folks that are committed to it, that are pouring big bucks into it.
And I would just like to add, I think for me, the way that I see this happening is, I think the church has been silent too long.
That's a good point.
And what's happening is, in our nation, we are no longer a Christian nation. And so the church was supposed to stand there as a light. Not how to do everything right or be perfect, but that there is a standard that God designed humanity to work a certain way. He created boundaries for us so that we can be healthy. And yet, since Christianity has pulled back, there's no standard. And so what we're living in now is a nation that doesn't have a standard moral system that the Bible has put forth and that our nation was constructed on. So what fills the void? Well, anything that you want as an individual, because now you rule and govern yourself, you're not accountable to a God. And so for me personally, I think the reason why we're seeing this massive shift so fast is because we reached that tipping point. The church is silent enough, we're no longer a Christian nation, and so now we're seeing all of this stuff just take off.
Just a comment, we had a chance, my wife and I, to go to the Henrietta Town Board last week when they were presenting, Planned Parenthood was presenting a petition to open up a clinic opposite Southtown Plaza, over by the Goodwill, if you know where that corner is. It was interesting, there were several, seemed like maybe 100 people who spoke out. But my comment, and I got a chance to do my speaking around 10:30 at night, and by 1 o'clock, the town board happily decided 3-2 to vote it down. So that was good news. I was in bed by then. But my point, the pitch that they were making, and feeds in that comment that Jason was just alluding to, Planned Parenthood people who were there were talking about, as were some pro-Planned Parenthood people, all the services other than abortion, how, quote, wonderful we are to provide this to black and brown and low-income families and individuals, women, obviously. I can say women, can I? Not women X. Okay, women. Okay. My point being, they were talking about all those other services, not the abortion piece, not the money piece. And I think what tipped it in the evening was that people began to talk about the baby and vote your conscience. And I think that my take is that really got at the minds of at least 3 out of the 5 people who voted against. So it was a good night.
I just wanted to make a comment in the sense that we have children ourselves that are in college and that are going through this where they're stating, you know, they want to be, you know, them or they, or, you know, their friends are trying to push them to be certain ways. And it is confusing the kids, and it's also turning your children almost against you, where they get defiant or they want to fight for what they think they're believing or what they think they know, but in reality, it's causing a lot more kind of havoc in the home. So we are feeling that ourselves, and we are seeing it, and with this happening, this is something that we need to, you know, stand ground and make sure that we, you know, fight this ourselves, because, you know, our old traditional values of when we were younger with our families and our grandparents, I mean, it was all unity. And as what you're seeing as we go forward, it's starting to be more of a separation. And that's what, you know, the main concern is. So I just wanted to make sure that, you know, you're not alone if you guys are feeling that.
And don't be afraid to have those conversations with your kids. I think to what Bridget referenced earlier today, that the church in many cases has pulled back from those conversations. That's so true. I mean, when those kids are asking those questions that they're doubting, and it can start at very young ages, have those conversations in an appropriate way, and, you know, in your family. But somebody is talking to your kids about these issues. Yeah, it's Bridget was right when she said, it's not that we're against sex ed. I totally believe in it. I just want it to come from me, and I wanted to communicate that to my kids. And I think that's appropriate that I do so. You know, I recognize my kids are going to want to talk to people other than mom and dad. And that's a part of life too, as they grow up. So try to surround them with people that can steer them in the right direction, right? It's important to have those conversations. I think about Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 and 25, where it talks about how he chose really to walk with the Lord. It's the faith chapter, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. And you know what I see in that is we often walk away and we use the word sin. But I get hung up sometimes on the fleeting pleasures of sin. Because the bottom line is sin is fun, right? I mean, it feels good. I mean, that's why people do it. Yeah, for a season. It's fleeting. And I think we have to communicate that to our kids and to say, you know what, at this time this may seem right, or it feels good, or it sounds like something you want to do. But it's short-lived. Here are the consequences of that, or here are the results of that, or you walk them through that. But if we act like some of these things are not pleasurable in the moment, they're going to find out sooner or later it is. And I think too often we don't balance that conversation.
You're getting your workout tonight, Steve.
Thank you. I'm Melanie, and I just started a organization in Canandaigua called Help Not Harm, and our website just went live yesterday. Has a lot of information on it, but I want to encourage you that what our group, what I have faced already in Canandaigua, is that you stand for truth, and you stand for this, you're going to be labeled. Not to discourage you, but to count the cost. Because what they're going to say is that you hate these kids for standing for truth and for standing on God's word. And you don't even have to stand, you don't even have to claim you're standing on God's word. But to really understand what Bridget was saying and to really get into the facts and the dangers of all of this, to understand this in the truth matters, and that's what love is about. So to say you're not affirming a kid, that's hating them, that's not loving them, I think that's kind of the Christian's Achilles heel, and I think that's kind of where churches want to stay silent, is because they don't want to appear like they're being hateful, judgmental, right? This is real love by trying to protect them and by trying to provide truth.
Yeah, thank you. And I was actually just having a conversation with Dr. Sanford, I think yesterday, on this. You know, we walk through Wegmans nowadays and you see the big signs, love is love. You know, and that's the narrative that's out there. And that's a really hard narrative to speak out against, because love is a Christian concept. And so if you don't love and affirm somebody and their views and opinions, then that means that you're unloving and that you're being intolerant and that you're hating them. And so, yeah, it is incredibly difficult, but we have to realize that there is truth on our side. That, you know, first of all, okay, so I'm a philosophy major, right? So first of all, they haven't even defined love, right? If somebody comes to you and says, you know, hey, can you define what a cat is for me? And they say, well, a cat is a cat. That has not defined it for you. So anybody that tries to say that to you, ask them, what do you mean by love? And I bet you're going to get a worldly definition of attraction or affirmation, but you don't get what love really means, that it's sacrificial, that you are putting that other person above yourself. And that's what it takes to show these kids that you love them, that you will be there for them and take care of them, even when they are engaging in things that you disagree with. You can tell them, I think that this is harmful. It's not good for you. I disagree with you, but I am still here for you. I will help you through this. We can talk about these issues. So talk to people about what they really mean by love, because I bet you they don't have a very good definition. And if you even just start with that, that's a way that you can show people that you're not being unloving. So yeah.
Okay, I think we'll see about wrapping it up at this point. I want to thank both Bridget, John, and Jason for being here and answering questions. You're great resources for us. I want to encourage you too. On Jason's website, you know, one of the things that Bridget mentioned was speak out. On Jason's website is a very easy means, as Bridget has already said, for you to contact your state representatives and tell them what you think about the pending legislation. If we don't speak out, if it goes on through the way that it is, it will take effect in 2024. That's the target date that's on the bill. So we don't have a lot of time. The good news is, because the legislative session has ended for the year, we've got a little bit of time. So talk it up. Make sure that the other people that you know that feel the same way as you do have the ability to find a way to let their legislators know. Okay? Really important. Once again, thank you both for being here. Appreciate it. Make sure that you pick up the freebies there in terms of on your way out. Thanks for being here tonight.